Berlin, in the summer of 1940, welcomed victory beyond belief. The soldiers of the Third Reich came home after only a year of war. They had conquered France. Central and Northern Europe had fallen too. These crowds were delirious with exultation and relief. They turned to their Führer in a frenzy of gratitude. They had not fancied war, they had feared defeat. Now they... The men came home. They were brown and fit, and only a few of them had died.
I just went shopping when somebody told me, "Don't you hear the noise?" And there I saw this part of the army coming back just near, so I bought a bowl of cherries and ran there. We all were so glad. We heard so much of the First World War with those dreadful battles and those many dead. I felt a sort of national pride. We ended the war so quick.
In cities untouched by war, the German people had hardly begun to give up the ways of peace. There was rationing, even shortages, but to make up for it, the regime preached enjoyment, luxury. While the British had declared frivolous things immoral, the Nazis tried to show that luxury still flourished. Promises were their propaganda, and those who ran the war effort came to believe their own promises. Only a few saw further.
Just about August, it was ordered that a lot of production was stopped or minimized or things like that. And there was a kind of euphoria that the war was, so to say, over. I didn't believe in that at all. No, I thought I knew the British, and I had the opinion that they would see this thing through and that the United States would join war, and therefore every effort should be made to prepare for a long blockade.
Hitler had no plans ready for a long struggle, no preparations for the total mobilization of all productive capacity. German industry had been geared to a blitzkrieg war. The regime still let the factories turn out peacetime goods. The workers, subjugated but not fully converted, watched the comings and goings of the Nazi princes without enthusiasm. Wanting to be loved, the Nazis gave and gave. For 1940, Propaganda Minister Dr. Goebbels was Father Christmas. He gave to children, he gave to mothers.
In Berlin wurde der neue Film Mutterliebe uraufgeführt. Auf Veranlassung von Reichsminister Dr. Goebbels lud die NSV 1200 Trägerinnen...
Ladies with larger broods were invited to the film premiere of Mother Love, the regime's hymn to family and folk community.
Papa weiterkommen, gell? Das heißt, wird uns ja vom Himmel aus helfen, so gut kann. Wird mit dem lieben Gott sprechen. Und weil so lustig ist und immer alle Engel lachen macht, da wird ihm der
On their breasts, they wore the Nazi Mother Cross.
Der liebe Papa.
The pram was the tank of the home front. The government hoped for a breakthrough on the birth rate. Happy babies, happy future mothers, and very specially, happy music soused the nation. big smile glued across the face of a people still often dubious and nervous was stretched even wider. Everybody must learn to enjoy the happy teamwork of Hitler's folk community.
Uhr. Der Wehrmachtbericht.
Radio was the instrument which the Nazis made their own from the beginning. Their foreign language broadcasts, technically marvelous but grotesquely unconvincing, reached greedily out to minds abroad.
Today's official German war communique reads as follows.
But listening to foreign radio was forbidden. Many, like the propaganda comics, Tran and Heller, argued the toss between getting a glimpse of the outside world and the risk of a jail sentence.
Sogar Zuchthaus.
Auch wenn es keiner merkt.
Ob das einer merkt oder nicht merkt, das spielt doch gar keine Rolle. So was tut man als guter Deutscher nicht.
Ja, aber man muss sich doch orientieren, was draußen vorgeht.
Na natürlich. Die ausländischen Sender, die sagen die reine Wahrheit. Nicht?
Klar.
Ja klar, du Döskopf. Hast du noch niemals etwas von dem Nachrichtensystem unserer Feinde gehört?
Ja, aber...
Nix, aber dann müsstest du wissen, dass alles nur darauf abzielt, unsere Widerstandskraft zu schwächen.
Herr J., ich bin doch alt genug, um unterscheiden zu können, was wahr ist und was nicht. Ach, immer noch das.
Wurde wegen Abhörens ausländischer Sender zu 2,5 Jahren Zuchthaus verurteilt.
If we listened to foreign radio, which we always did, we turned it very low and we used to sit right up close against it. And I remember one particular moment when my son, who was a little schoolboy, told me that he had a very funny story to tell me, that his friend's mother also listened to the radio with her ear right up against it, the same as we did. And I suddenly realized that I could have her imprisoned, she could have me imprisoned, because these two children had been talking about it.
As well as geography and the rest, Nazi schools were obliged to add a special subject. Children were taught, with pictures and measurements, the dimensions of a healthy Aryan race. Official films prepared the Germans for the consequences of keeping the race pure. The mentally incurable, condemned as the bad seed, went to experimental gas chambers.
Das deutsche Volk kennt das ganze Ausmaß dieses Elends wohl kaum. Es kennt nicht den drückenden Geist jener Häuser, in denen Tausende lallende Schwachsinnige künstlich ernährt und gepflegt werden müssen, die tiefer stehen als jedes Tier. Aber wir haben diesen Menschen die Möglichkeit gegeben, in ihren Kindern ihr Leid zu verdoppeln und zu vervielfachen. Wer solche Wesen gesehen hat, der wird wohl nicht mehr behaupten können, dass die Verhinderung zur Entstehung solcher Wesen nicht human wäre.
But now, for once, the Germans learned what was going on and protested. Bishop Galen of Münster attacked euthanasia from the pulpit. For a time, the program was stopped. A controlled press avoided such misgivings. Some newspapers were mere party sheets of hate and lies. Some slipped criticism between the lines. None of them satisfied a people which was still highly educated.
It was terribly frustrating never to be allowed to say your opinion openly. I myself was quite happy when I was called up early 1940 to the army, and that suddenly left behind all the oppression I had every day. I didn't, being a soldier, you don't read newspapers, you don't listen to the radio, you're not always
under the stress of the propaganda which was pointed at you every hour.
European war became World War in June 1941. The Nazi leaders had secretly resolved that the conquest of Russia must come.
Reichsminister Dr. Goebbels verließ die Proklamation des Führers.
Deutsches Volk, in diesem Augenblick vollzieht sich ein Aufmarsch, der den Ausdehn
For many, the attack on the Soviet Union brought fear and bewilderment.
bisher gesehen hat.
Of course, I had heard of certain preparations, but it was all well hushed up, and till the last moment I didn't think that the war would come about.
For a long war, Germany would need to have the South Russian oil fields for her own. Russia had delivered 1 million tons of oil the previous year under the Nazi-Soviet pact, now flung away.
As a matter of fact, we had the greatest trade agreements with them that we ever had, and they delivered promptly, and from an economic point of view, everything seemed to be in order. I personally had, through my men, negotiations with them of putting up a synthetic fiber mill in Russia, and the treaty was signed on the 15th of June 1941. And the first 10 million marks in gold should be shipped on July 1st of 1941.
Das waren die Soldaten, ja, die gehen richtig ran.
The Germans drove eastwards over disintegrating Russian armies.
Das war die Artillerie.
Victory looked like a matter of weeks, another blitzkrieg. And morale at home revived.
Das waren die Soldaten, so was schafft ein Zivilist.
Goering inspected what was now the German colony of Ukraine, intended to be a serf region of agriculture. Nazi experts on the Slavs hoped that this simple folk with simple customs would enjoy this prospect. 6 months later, in the blinding snow before Moscow, the Germans were stopped. They lacked winter clothing, and the government appealed for furs and warm coats.
An den letzten Tagen der Sammlung drängen sich vor den Annahmestellen die Gebefreudigen, um ihre Spenden abzuliefern.
Na, Volksgenosse, tut Ihnen das nicht leid? So ein schönes Feld, oh, ist das warm da drin.
No amount of rehearsed enthusiasm could conceal that this was the Reich's first military reverse. The Minister of Munitions and head of the war effort, Fritz Todt, flew to inspect the construction work on the Eastern Front. One of the men who should have been on the plane was Hitler's court architect, the producer of the Nuremberg rallies, Albert Speer.
I heard in the headquarters that Todt's plane crashed. He was dead, and half an hour afterwards I was asked to come to Hitler. And to my great surprise, he told me, "You shall be his successor in all his offices."
Todt got the funeral of a National Socialist hero. By now, nearly 250,000 Germans had been killed on the battlefronts, but Todt was the first of Hitler's close comrades to meet death in the war. Hitler was shaken. The war had reached him personally. Speer had already seen the chaotic, disconnected way that Nazi war industry worked. Transport, munitions, all had to be brought under a single control. One of its first targets was the labor supply. Nazi Germany had never mobilized its full workforce.
Tried to get the women in the war production machinery, but it was opposed by Saugel, who was in charge of all the labor. The thing came to Göring, and Göring flatly denied too. Then it came to the decision of Hitler, and Hitler also said, no, the women must be preserved. They have other tasks. They are for the family. They have to bear children, and it would spoil their health and their morale if they are working in the factories.
But Ukrainian women were being imported as maids, foreign conscripts for slave labor. Under Speer, a great irony was fulfilled, for Germany was becoming exactly what the Nazis said it would not become. They had promised to return to the land, an end to great capitalism. Instead, the armaments drive was strengthening the vast industrial monopolies and swelling the cities with German and foreign labor. In 2.5 years, Speer multiplied armament production nearly 4 times. 80% of industry came under his control. He brushed aside bureaucracies and worked through his own experts.
He had ideas, and he put all his energy behind these ideas and put them through with very much success. He didn't know how things had been done in the past because he hadn't anything to do with it, so he didn't know what was impossible and was possible, and he succeeded sometimes in doing that impossible too.
It is astounding for everybody who didn't live in our authoritarian system to hear that it was difficult to get through with orders, but it was difficult because Germany was divided in many districts, in 32 districts, and at the head of every district was a Gau leader. He was a strong political man and had the absolute power in his district. He was only subordinated to Hitler himself. So when my orders didn't please one of the Gau leaders, possibly they weren't carried out.
Tank production showed how even Speer failed to get all of his way. He could not slice through the competing hierarchies which were Hitler's chosen style of government. There were too many types of tanks, too few tanks in all, too many calibers of gun, and different sizes of ammunition.
Hitler thought he is far superior to such problems, and what for others would have been discussions of weeks and weeks, for him was a decision of just a fraction of a minute. Of course, there was a change too. One can never say that a man is always the same person, and Hitler changed a lot from 42 to 43. In 43, he was more and more convinced that he doesn't need no more the advice of anybody, and he made the decisions by himself without listening.
Hitler spent more and more time at the Wolf's Lair, his melancholy remote encampment at Rustenburg in the East Prussian forest. Those around him were obsequious. The better advisors lost touch. Hitler's personal SS adjutant was Richard Schulze-Kossens.
Nearly all ministers were stationed at Berlin, and some of them had contact officers in the headquarters. Only Ribbentrop, Himmler, and sometimes Göring had their own headquarters not so far from our headquarters. Speer was very often in the headquarters because his ministry was very important for the war. Only Bormann was always in the headquarters. There was the only direct contact to Hitler.
Bormann, as his secretary, was the most powerful man, more powerful, I think, than Hitler, because when the power was divided, all those men who were in power had to go via him to Hitler, except me. I had the direct access to Hitler.
there wasn't much cooperation. The cooperation was in the lower levels of the smaller technocrats. We didn't have anything like a cabinet. Ministers met, if at all, very seldom, and didn't talk about very important matters, so was my impression. Every ministry worked for itself, and sometimes they got orders from Hitler, but very, very seldom.
Foreign visitors like Mannerheim, the Finnish leader, could see that Hitler was living in a world of illusion. He still trusted the reassurances of Goering, head of the Luftwaffe. Goering, a few months later, claimed that his aircraft could supply the Eastern Front, even when a whole army was cut off at Stalingrad.
Achtung, ich rufe noch einmal Stalingrad.
Hier ist Stalingrad. Hier ist die Front an der Wolga.
Achtung, die U-Boot-Fahrer im Atlantik.
Christmas 1942.
Seebootsstützpunkt am Atlantik. Achtung, Catania. Hier ist die Mittelmeerfront und Afrika.
The men at Stalingrad had come through on the radio link-up loud and clear. But the brave words were faked in a Berlin studio. For the last time, the cathedral stood undamaged as the Christmas fair took place in Berlin. But Stalingrad was still cut off, and deep down the nation sensed what was to happen.
3. Februar. Das Oberkommando der Wehrmacht gibt bekannt. Der Kampf um Stalingrad ist zu Ende.
The Battle of Stalingrad has come to an end. For once the radio spoke the truth, and with some dignity. 91,000 survivors surrendered. Only a few thousand ever saw Germany again.
I was not long in the headquarters, but I felt very significant the atmosphere on this day. All people were depressed, and Hitler himself was very serious, and he stared on his soup without saying any word, and he was very depressed.
The world realized, and the Germans realized, that this was the turning point. This was the tragedy which could not be hidden. And Stalingrad did not come alone. A week before the city fell, the Germans learned that the Allies would demand unconditional surrender. There was then to be no mercy for the Germans. Nazi and non-Nazi both lost some illusions and drew a little closer together. The escape hatches had been bolted. This was to be a total war, fought to the finish.
The general feeling was, well, we can do nothing. It doesn't matter what we do. We'd better stick it out. Ausharren was the word, I remember, on everyone's lips. There's no alternative. We've got to fight to the bitter end. And this...
Of the national uprising against Napoleon, they were empty now. In 1943, it was better listening to music than to news. It was total war and retreat on all fronts. Total war meant that even German women must work. It brought its own sour humor.
There was a slogan, do enjoy war, peace will be dreadful.
There was a new sort of equality among the boys drafted to the mines and factories. The Hitler youth was mobilized into production and eventually into battle. Under siege, the barriers between people crumbled as they had crumbled in the London Blitz. People wanted to huddle together, to sing and forget. By the morning, they might be dead. By day, the American bomber fleets ranged over the Reich. At night came the British. In the shelters, the people waited for dawn and wondered if their cities would still be there.
When we had the first bombs, we were shocked. We saw all the sky lighted up from the fire. It was an enormous and very dreadful sight. We were very angry when we saw that so many residential areas were destroyed. There were so few men left that everybody who had the strength was firefighting.
One by one, the German cities were incinerated by firestorms. 10 days' raids on Hamburg left 40,000 dead. Goebbels noted, the people in the West are gradually beginning to lose courage. Hell like that is hard to bear.
I think that the bombing hadn't the effect one would have thought. It had the effect of bringing people together. If you were all under the same bombs, it didn't really matter whether your neighbor was a Nazi or what they were.
To avoid seeing the ruins, Hitler's rare visits to Berlin were made by night. And yet, banners were ordered for his birthday. They read, "Our walls have broken, but not our hearts."
Hitler lost more and more his sense of reality. He never had the will. He must see with his own eyes what the war was. We had no information from outside, and so I had the feeling to live in a monastery, in a concentration camp. One of the generals once said, "I feel like a concentration camp. We are included, and we all use the same phrases. We are all thinking the same. We are all hearing the same. We are all led in our thoughts and our feelings by Hitler. We all were playing on a play, each his role, and he was the only one who knew the script. He made us all do our play and speak our text. Nobody else knew how it would end.
Neither Hitler nor Goering nor Himmler were seen in public, only Goebbels. Whenever there was a very heavy bombing, Goebbels stood there on the marketplace and held his speeches and tried to say ausharren, and I personally had respect because there was a sort of inspiring. You were sort of in a trance.
A strained, exhausted nation could still lose itself in youth. The orchestras still gave what was great and true in the tradition of German art. In the galleries, there was only the empty grimacing of Nazi painting, Nazi sculpture. True Aryan models simpered and scowled, their features carefully designed to portray the victorious Nordic race. Race was the empire of Himmler and the SS. But now the SS was itself an empire. Himmler, the ex-chicken farmer, ruled the death camps and the concentration camps. The SS had its own schools and factories and courts. It administered huge tracts of the occupied East. It was the instrument of German dominion over Europe. It was even an army. The generals had little control over the hundreds of thousands of elite troops in the Waffen-SS divisions. Into the SS training schools there were drawn Aryan-looking volunteers from the occupied countries, for the SS state was to be not merely German, but European.
All had volunteered for active service in the Waffen-SS because they regarded the fight against Bolshevism as the most important task in Europe. New was the point of European education because we were of the opinion that only an imaginary contrast existed between nations who have the same or were from the same origin, yes?
For those of different race origin, there was no place. For the Jews, there was deportation to eastern ghettos, and then the gas chambers of the SS. The official word was resettlement. Most Germans preferred to believe that it meant no more than that.
Hitler often mentioned that he is hating the Jews, and he gave many examples already in an early time when I was with him. And I should have been warned that he is serious about it, because he proved to be serious about other things he predicted too.
Eines Nachts 24 Uhr ein Läuten an der Tür.
One night, must have been around midnight, the doorbell rang. I opened it, and in front of me there stood a Jewish couple. This was how I began to help persecuted Jews. All of a sudden, I'd entered into an invisible circle of people who smuggled Jews about. As soon as one hiding place had been detected, they were quickly passed on. They'd always move about at night. That's how I came to belong to a group who had to put up Jews when they were passed on like this. I've never found out who it was who'd sent them to me in the first place. Decent people, I'm sure. The problem started with the feeding of the Jewish people. Well, they neither had food rationing cards, nor did they have any money. So we, in our turn, we made use of friends who exchanged their cigarette ration cards for the odd potato or some bread.
Die uns dann mal ein paar Kartoffeln und ein bisschen Brot für eine Raucherkarte eintauschten.
One day, a friend of ours who used to collect food cards for these Jews came to me, and she came with another woman with dyed blonde hair. I can see her sitting there now, twisting her wedding ring and telling me that it wouldn't be for long, that she would help me in the house, and her husband need never go out. He could live in the cellar or wherever.
But Christopher Bielenberg's husband was away, and he was involved in a plot to overthrow Hitler. She consulted her trusted neighbor and friend, Karl Langbehn, another conspirator. Langbehn told her compassionately but firmly that the risks to herself and her family and to the conspiracy were too great.
They only have to strike the head.
Only the commanders of the army could strike effectively at the head. Others had struck bravely at the tail and perished. In Munich, a few students round the Schul brother and sister had protested with leaflets and been slaughtered. In Berlin, a communist spy team led by Harro Schulze-Beuys and the Harnacks had been crushed. Communists, socialists, Christians, anonymous men and women defied the dictator in tiny groups. 150,000 Germans, suffered prison or worse for political resistance. The plot against the Snake's Head was a federation of plots. There were conservatives like Gödler, aristocrats like Moltke, churchmen like Bonhoeffer, diplomats like Trott. Faced with defeat, many staff officers joined in. All were slow to accept that to strike at the head demanded the physical murder of Hitler. But in 1944, there appeared a man for action, Colonel Count Klaus von Stauffenberg.
All the difference was brought in or caused when Stauffenberg came to Berlin. He had lost his left eye, his left hand, of 3 fingers of his left hand, and his right hand altogether. Originally, he was only the planner of the coup d'etat, but he had to report to Hitler's headquarters and to attend conferences there. And this enabled him to get really near to Hitler and then to make an attempt, which he did on July 2044.
He's still alive. We went to Hitler's bunker and we met him. Maybe it was an hour after this explosion. He looked funny because his hair stood up like a brush, and his trousers were slit in small stripes.
At the War Ministry in Berlin, the plotting generals believed that Hitler was dead.
When I came to the headquarters, Stauffenberg was busy with telephoning the various army commands, and Hafen informed me of what had happened, how they have thrown the bomb, and then he said Hitler's dead. And we really did believe it, because Stauffenberg then came in. We had a short talk with him. He was much too busy to give details. He said, Hitler is dead, leave everything alone, and we'll see to what can be done.
The man the plotters ordered to occupy the city was Major Otto Rehmer, a fanatical soldier programmed to obey any superior order. At first, he obeyed the plotters. Then Goebbels got hold of him.
Goebbels begrüßte mich sehr erleichtert und freudestrahlend und sagte, Rehmer, was wissen Sie?
Goebbels was really very pleased to see me. He was beaming. He said, Rehmer, what do you know about all this? What's going on here? What orders have you got? I said, Minister, I have come to you so that you can clarify the situation. Goebbels replied, they're trying to pull the wool over your eyes. Hitler's alive. I've just spoken to him. I was so astonished that I said, please let me speak to the Führer. And this was done. On the other end of the line, Hitler said, Herr Rehmer, you see, I am alive. I am Adolf Hitler. You recognize my voice. Now do you believe I'm alive?
Ich lebe also. Ich bin Adolf Hitler. Hören Sie meine Stimme. Glauben Sie, dass ich lebe.
Motives in court. Count von Schwerin was an officer who had served in Poland.
Politischen Erfahrungen persönlich gemacht habe, hat für mich mancherlei Schwierigkeiten in der Folge gehabt, weil ich ja sehr lange für das Deutschtum in Polen gearbeitet habe und aus dieser Zeit heraus ein vielfaches Hin und Her in der Einstellung gegenüber den Polen praktisch erlebt habe. Das ist eine...
Aber ich war es hin und her, dass sie dem Nationalsozialismus zulegen.
Gedacht an die vielen Morde.
Morde? Sie sind ja ein Schäbchen!
Went in and out, and he became totally apathetic, non-interested in everything, and it was a very critical situation on the West Front and on the East Front too. And some days it was like Hitler didn't exist.
He was deteriorating, certainly in his health, but I wouldn't go so far to say that he was no more responsible of what he was doing. In some way, he was...